The stars had never been kind to the small, but the Valeth Eternal Empire had made sure they were cruel. For 12,000 years, the insectoid Valeth had ruled over 900 star systems with the cold patience of a species that had forgotten what it felt like to be challenged. And in all that time, not a single younger race had refused their demands, not once, not ever, because the math was always the same: submit or be erased from the memory of the galaxy. Humanity knew the math too. They had 17 colony worlds and a defense fleet that could barely patrol their own borders. And they traded with alien merchants who looked at them the way a farmer looks at cattle that have learned to open gates. Amusing, but ultimately irrelevant. So, when the Valeth dreadnought called the Will Absolute dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Earth on a Tuesday morning and blotted out the sun over the Pacific Ocean, most of the galaxy assumed the outcome was already written. Ambassador Cass Sovereign Tyle Vron stood on the command platform of his ship and looked down at the blue and green world beneath him with the same expression he had worn over 100 other worlds before this one: bored superiority. The face of someone completing a task that was beneath them but necessary, like cleaning dust from a shelf. He broadcast his message on every human frequency at once, and every screen on every colony and every station and every ship flickered and showed his tall, angular form draped in the living silk of his office. "Species designation human," he began, his voice translated into every human language simultaneously. "The Valeth Eternal Empire has observed your expansion into territories adjacent to Imperial holdings, and has determined that your civilization now falls within the scope of Imperial governance." He paused, not for drama, but because pausing was tradition, and the Valeth loved tradition more than they loved anything else. "You are hereby issued the Edict of Submission, the terms of which are absolute and non-negotiable." The terms rolled out like a funeral march. All human military vessels were to be disarmed within 30 standard cycles. All 17 colony worlds would be reclassified as Valeth tributary holdings. 15% of the human population would be conscripted into the Empire's labor caste to serve wherever the Empire required. All human governments would be dissolved and replaced with Valeth overseer councils. And as a gesture of fealty, the leaders of Earth would kneel before the Sovereign in a live broadcast transmitted to every species in the Galactic Communication Network. That last part was the key, and everyone watching knew it. It was never really about the ships, or the colonies, or even the labor conscription. It was about the kneeling, because kneeling was how the Valeth broke a species, not in body, but in spirit. Species knelt on the galactic stage. It never stood up again. Not truly, not in any way that mattered. Across the galaxy, dozens of alien species watched the broadcast on their own screens, in their own cities, on their own conquered worlds, and most of them felt nothing, because they had already knelt years or centuries or millennia ago, and the memory of standing had faded like a scar that no longer hurt. The Rithani Concord, a trade-focused avian species who had submitted to the Valeth 600 years earlier, sent humanity a private message through back-channel frequencies. Kneel and survive. That is the only equation that has ever worked. Do not be foolish. It was meant as advice, and it was honest, and it was wrong. The United Terran Council convened an emergency session within the hour, and the chamber was full of fear. You could smell it, taste it, see it in the way hands trembled and voices cracked, because everyone in that room understood what the end numbers said, and the numbers said humanity would lose. Some politicians argued for negotiation, for buying time, for finding some compromise that would preserve at least a fraction of human independence. And their arguments were reasonable and logical, and built on the kind of careful thinking that had kept humanity alive in a dangerous galaxy. Then Admiral Kale Marin walked to the center of the chamber. She was not a tall woman, and she was not a loud woman. But she had commanded the Terran Defense Fleet for 11 years, and had spent every single one of those years preparing for the day that everyone told her would never come. And now that it had come, she was the calmest person in the room. She played back the Valith broadcast on the chamber's main screen, and let it run until it reached the word kneel, and then she paused it. The word hung in the air like smoke. "They have made a mistake," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried to every corner of the silent chamber. "They studied our trade routes, and they studied our population numbers, and they measured the tonnage of our fleet, and they calculated that we are small and weak and rational enough to accept their terms." She looked around the room at every face. "But they did not study our history," she said. "They do not know what we did at Thermopylae, or what we endured at Stalingrad, or how we clawed our way out of every extinction-level event that this universe threw at us for 300,000 years. And they do not understand that there is something inside this species that would rather burn than bow." The vote was called. It was not unanimous. 43 members voted to negotiate, and their names would be recorded without shame, because courage is not the absence of fear, and disagreement is not cowardice, but the majority was decisive, and the decision was made. Humanity's response was broadcast on the same galactic frequency the Valith had used, so that every species with a receiver could hear it. The transmission was short. "Humanity does not kneel." And then the screen showed a single image. Every Terran warship in the fleet lighting its engines at the same moment. A wave of blue-white fire spreading across the dark, like stars being born. On the bridge of the Will Absolute, Sovereign Tyelvron watched the transmission end, and felt something shift inside his chest. Something cold and unfamiliar that crawled through his thoughts like water through a crack in stone. His second-in-command, a veteran officer named Vrethka, stood beside him and studied the Sovereign's face with the careful attention of someone who had served him for decades. "Sovereign," Vrethka said quietly, "what you are feeling, I believe the humans have a word for it." Tyelvron did not look away from the screen, where the human fleet burned bright against the black. "Uncertainty," Vrethka said. And for the first time in 400 years of issuing edicts that had never once been refused, the sovereign of the Valith Eternal Empire had nothing to say. Across the galaxy, the broadcast was replayed and analyzed and debated, and on 100 conquered worlds, under 100 different suns, beings who had long since forgotten what defiance looked like, watched 17 billion humans choose fire over surrender, and something stirred in them. Not hope, not yet, but something older and deeper, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The Valith had expected silence. They received a declaration of war. The Valith war machine moved with the confidence of something that had never been stopped, and in the first week of the war, it seemed like that confidence was justified. They hit New Carthage first, because it was humanity's largest outer colony, and because destroying it would send a message that even the most stubborn species could understand. 80 million people lived on that world, and the Valith sent a fleet large enough to crack it open like an egg. The plan was simple, as Valith plans always were: arrive in overwhelming force, demonstrate what that force could do, and wait for the surrender signal that always came, because it had always come from every species that had ever faced Imperial guns. But something went wrong with the plan, and that something was Colonel Davi Okonkwo. Okonkwo was a tall, quiet man from the colony of New Lagos, who had spent most of his career running border patrols and settling minor disputes between mining companies. Nothing in his service records suggested that he was the kind of man who would change the course of a galactic war. But war has a way of finding people who did not know what they were capable of until the moment arrived. When the Valith fleet dropped out of FTL above New Carthage, Okonkwo was commanding the orbital defense garrison. 3 frigates and a handful of armed stations that looked like toys next to the Valith warships. Every tactical model said the garrison would fall in under an hour. It held for 11. Okonkwo fought like a man who had decided that time was the most valuable currency in the universe, and he was going to buy as much of it as he could, with everything he had. And what he was buying it for was the civilian evacuation. Transports were loading families and children, and scrambling for the jump points, and every minute the garrison held was another 1,000 people who would live to see tomorrow. Valith capital ships like insects biting a giant, too small to kill, but too fast and too vicious to ignore. And every time a Valith gunner turned to swat one away, the transports gained another few seconds. When his last frigate was crippled and burning and dead in the void, Okonkwo did something the Valith had never seen before. He pointed his broken ship at the open hangar bay of the nearest Valith carrier, and accelerated, and in the last 3 seconds of his life, he sent a single message to the evacuation fleet. "Go now, I bought you enough." The explosion tore through the carrier, and took 2 escort cruisers with it, and 62,000 civilians made it to the jump points, and the Valith stood in the wreckage of their easy victory, and tried to understand what had just happened. They could not understand it, not really, because the Valith calculated war in terms of acceptable losses and rational outcomes, and nothing about a man flying a burning ship into the heart of an enemy fleet for the sake of strangers was rational by any math they knew. Back on Earth, the news of New Carthage hit like a hammer, but it did not break humanity. It forged them. Something happened in those first days that the Valith had not predicted because it had never happened before in all their centuries of conquest. Humanity did not splinter, or negotiate, or look for a way to make the pain stop. Instead, it mobilized in a way that turned the entire species into a single burning purpose. Factories that had been building consumer goods retooled overnight to produce weapons and armor and ship components. And the workers did not need to be ordered because they had seen the footage from New Carthage, and they had heard Okonkwo's last words, and they understood in their bones what was at stake. Civilian transport ships were brought into shipyards and came out armored and armed, ugly and brutal, and nothing like proper warships, but carrying enough firepower to hurt anything they hit. Universities shut down their regular programs and turned every lab and every lecture hall into a weapons research center. And students who had been studying art and philosophy and literature were suddenly learning how to build better missiles and crack Valith shield frequencies. Volunteers flooded every recruitment station on every colony, and they were not just soldiers, they were engineers and doctors and pilots and cooks and mechanics and teachers, all of them saying the same thing in 100 different ways, which was simply, "Tell me where to go and what to do." Admiral Marin watched this transformation from the bridge of her flagship, and felt something she had not expected to feel in the opening days of a war they were supposed to lose. She felt hope. She gathered her senior commanders and unveiled what she called the Prometheus Doctrine, a war strategy built on 3 principles that no Valith commander had ever encountered because no species had ever been desperate enough and stubborn enough and angry enough to try them. The first principle was asymmetry over parity. Do not try to match the Valith fleet ship for ship, because that math will never work. Instead, find the places where being smaller and faster and more creative is an advantage, and exploit them without mercy. The second principle was aggression as defense. Never let the enemy rest or regroup or predict what was coming next. Hit them where they did not expect to be hit. Make them react instead of act. Keep them off balance and afraid. The third principle was sacrifice as strategy. Accept losses that the Valith would consider unthinkable in order to inflict damage that was disproportionate and devastating, because the Valith valued their ships more than humanity valued anything except survival. She tested the doctrine at the Battle of the Kessler Line near the Tau Ceti system, and the test was spectacular. Marin lured a Valith battle group of 40 capital ships into a dense asteroid corridor, where their massive vessels could not maneuver freely. And then she unleashed her fleet, Small, fast ships that fought like wolves, darting in packs, striking hard, and vanishing before the Valith guns could track them. The Valith commanders were frustrated, but not worried, because they still had overwhelming firepower. And then Marin triggered the second part of her trap. Pre-placed charges, buried inside dozens of asteroids, detonated simultaneously, shattering the rocks into clouds of high-velocity shrapnel that screamed through the corridor like a metal storm. The Valith shields were designed to stop energy weapons, lasers and plasma, and the elegant destructive tools of civilized warfare, and they performed beautifully against those threats. But they were not designed to stop 10 million chunks of raw stone and iron, traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. And the shrapnel tore through the battle group like teeth through paper. 14 Valith capital ships died in that corridor, and humanity lost 30 smaller vessels. And by the cold math of fleet tonnage, it was a Valith victory. But by the math that actually mattered, strategic impact, resource drain, psychological damage, it was a catastrophe for the Empire. Across the galaxy, other species began paying closer attention. Councillor Prith of the Rathani Concord, the same species that had told humanity to kneel, sat in her office, reviewing the battle data from the Kessler line, and felt her feathers rise in a way they had not risen in years. A biological response, her species associated with the recognition of a predator. She sent a private encrypted note to the Rathani Governing Council that read simply, "They are not just fighting, they are adapting faster than anything in the Imperial Tactical Database. Revise all threat models immediately." Bridge of the Will Absolute, Sovereign Tylvron, received the battle report and read it 3 times. And then he did something his advisors had never seen him do. He changed his plans. He ordered 3 full battle fleets redeployed from other sectors of the Empire and directed toward human space. And when his generals protested that this would leave tributary systems exposed and vulnerable, he overruled them with a voice that carried an edge none of them had heard before. "This species," he said, staring at the tactical display where the Kessler Line debris field glowed like a wound, "will not be managed. It will be crushed, completely, before it teaches the rest of the galaxy that we can bleed." But it was already too late for that. Because on a dozen conquered worlds, beings who had watched the battle footage were already whispering to each other in the dark. And the thing they were whispering was a question that the Valith Empire had spent 12,000 years trying to silence. Years making sure nobody asked. What if they lose? The Valith did not understand mercy as a weakness, because they did not understand mercy at all. And so when the war entered its 3rd month, and humanity had still not broken, they reached for the tool they had always used when patience ran out. They chose the colony of Meridian. Meridian was not a military target. It was a farming world, a gentle green place of rolling hills and wide rivers, where 22 million people lived quiet lives, growing food for the outer colonies. And the most dangerous thing on the entire planet was probably a tractor. The Valith burned it from orbit in 6 hours. They used thermal bombardment, the kind that turns soil to glass and water to steam, and leaves nothing behind except a smooth, dead surface that reflects starlight like a mirror. And they broadcast the entire thing on every galactic frequency so that every species could watch and remember what happens to those who resist. 22 million people died on Meridian. Families and farmers and children, and old people who had never held a weapon in their lives. And the Valith expected this to be the blow that finally shattered human resolve, because it had always worked before. Because showing a species the true cost of defiance had always been enough to make them stop. They were wrong again. The news of Meridian hit humanity like a blade through the chest. And for one terrible day, there was silence across every colony, and every station, and every ship, as people absorbed what had happened. And in that silence there was grief so vast and so deep that it seemed like it might swallow everything. But grief is not the same as defeat, and on the second day the silence ended, and what replaced it was something the Valeth should have feared far more than any fleet. It was rage. Not the hot, stupid rage that burns out quickly and leaves ashes behind, but the cold, deep rage that settles into bone and becomes permanent. Ordinary people into something that cannot be stopped, because they have passed beyond the point where pain or fear or death can change their course. Remember, Meridian was carved into the hull of every warship in the Terran fleet within a week, and it was etched onto every soldier's armor and painted on every bulkhead of every station. And it was not a slogan, it was a promise. Recruitment did not spike after Meridian. It erupted. And the volunteers who came forward had a look in their eyes that the recruitment officers recognized immediately, because it was the same look that Admiral Marin had carried since the day the edict was issued. The look of someone who has decided that some things matter more than survival. While humanity's anger burned bright and steady, a woman named Lian Zhao was given command of the most secret program in the Terran military, Operation Revenant. Zhao was not a typical officer. She had spent 15 years as a smuggler running goods through the lawless corridors between alien territories before the war convinced her that her particular set of skills might be more useful to her species than to her bank account. And she had a talent for making things disappear that the military found very interesting. Her engineers took salvaged Valeth technology and combined it with human ingenuity in ways that the Valeth would have considered impossible. And what they built was a fleet of stealth corvettes, so small and so quiet that they could hide inside the Empire's own FTL communication network, riding the signal waves like ghosts in the walls of a house. The Ghost Fleet began its work in the 4th month of the war, and it was devastated. Valeth's supply convoys, that had been running safely for centuries, simply vanished. One moment they were there on the tracking screens, and the next moment there was nothing but debris and silence. And the Valeth could not find the enemy, because Zhao's ships were already gone before the explosions finished, slipping back into the communication network like shadows returning to the dark. Fuel depots that supplied the frontline fleets exploded without warning. Ammunition stores disappeared overnight, and repair stations were sabotaged so subtly that the damage was not discovered until ships that had been repaired fell apart in the middle of combat. The Valeth were furious, but they were also confused, because their entire military doctrine was built on the assumption that war was conducted between fleets in open space, and they had no framework for understanding an enemy that fought like smoke. But the Ghost Fleet was not the only crack forming in the Empire's foundations. On factory worlds deep inside Valeth territory, something was happening that no Imperial overseer wanted to report to their superiors. The tributary species were beginning to resist, not openly and not violently, but in ways that were almost impossible to detect. Punish because they were almost impossible to prove. The Droon were a reptilian species who had been conquered 2,000 years ago, and had served as the Empire's primary industrial labor force ever since, building the weapons and ships and infrastructure that kept the Valeth in power. And they had been doing this work so long that most of the galaxy had forgotten they were anything other than workers. But the Droon had not forgotten. Equipment began failing on Droon factory worlds. Critical machines broke down at exactly the wrong moment. Production quotas were missed by margins that were just small enough to blame on mechanical error rather than sabotage. And quality control reports showed defect rates that crept upwards so slowly that by the time anyone noticed the trend, thousands of substandard components had already been shipped to the front lines. The Ilshari were even more subtle. They were an aquatic species who served as the Empire's navigators because their brains had an extraordinary ability to calculate FTL trajectories, and without them, the Valeth fleet could still travel between stars, but not with the precision and speed that military operations required. Ilshari navigators began making errors, small ones, the kind that added hours or days to fleet movements, the kind that could be explained away as fatigue or miscalculation. And each individual error meant nothing, but together they formed a pattern that was slowly strangling the Empire's ability to move its forces where they needed to be. Terran intelligence officer Major Sarah Voss noticed the pattern before anyone else did, and she understood immediately what it meant. The Empire was not a solid wall. It was a wall made of bricks that had been cemented together by fear, and fear was beginning to lose its grip. Voss began sending messages through covert channels to contacts on tributary worlds, and her messages were careful and deliberate. For alliance, or promise liberation, because she knew that such promises would sound hollow from a species that was still fighting for its own survival. Instead, she sent something simpler and more powerful. "We see you," she told the Droon and the Ilshari, and every other conquered species that was quietly pulling at its chains. "We know what you are doing, and we remember you. And when this is over, there will be a reckoning." Back at the front lines, the Veilith threw everything they had at Forge Station, humanity's primary shipyard orbiting Mars, the place where the new warships were being built that were slowly closing the gap between the two fleets. The armada they sent was massive, and Admiral Marin commanded the defense personally, because she knew that if Forge Station fell, the war was over. The Battle of Forge Station lasted 3 days, and it was the most brutal engagement of the war so far. Marin used rotating defensive lines that kept fresh ships in fight, while damaged ones fell back to repair. And she deployed drone swarms that confused Veilith targeting systems and soaked up fire that would have destroyed manned vessels. And when the battle reached its most desperate point, and the Veilith assault ships were breaking through the inner defensive ring, she gave an order that the Veilith called insanity. She told the captains of the most damaged ships, the ones that were already dying, to overload their reactors and ram the enemy formations. They did it without hesitation, and the explosions ripped holes in the Veilith lines that the remaining Terran ships poured through like water through a broken dam. And when it was over, the Veilith withdrew with a quarter of their assault fleet turned to wreckage. Sovereign Tylvran convened his war council after Forge Station, and for the first time, his generals told him something he did not want to hear. At current losses, the Veilith would win. The math still favored them. Empire, but victory would take decades instead of months, and the cost would be ruinous. One general, named Vretzal, said what the others would not. "Sovereign, we are not losing battles. We are losing something worse. We are losing the narrative, because every species in the Empire is watching this war, and they are beginning to hope." Tylvran dismissed the council without responding, but he did not dismiss the words, because he knew they were true. And on a Droon factory world, far from the front lines, a young worker named Korath picked up a cutting tool and etched something into the casing of a weapons component that would be shipped to a Veilith warship the next day. It was a human phrase, one that Major Voss had included in her last broadcast, and it was only 2 words long: not yet. 9 months into the war, the galaxy began to understand that this was no longer a rebellion being crushed. It was a fire that was spreading, and the Veilith Empire had no idea how to put it out. Admiral Marin had spent those 9 months bleeding the Empire's fleets and rebuilding her own, and now, for the first time since the war began, she had enough ships and enough intelligence and enough fury to do something more than defend. She could attack. She called it the Prometheus Offensive, and it was the most ambitious military operation humanity had ever attempted, targeting not the Veilith fleets themselves, but the thing that held the entire Empire together: the Nexus Corridors. The Nexus Corridors were ancient FTL routes that connected the Veilith core systems to each other, and to every tributary world in their domain, and they were the veins through which the Empire's lifeblood flowed. Supplies and troops and orders and control all traveled through these corridors. And without them, The 900 systems of the Veilith Empire would become 900 isolated islands, with no way to coordinate or reinforce each other. Marin launched 12 simultaneous strikes across Veilith territory, and each one targeted a Nexus relay station, the massive orbital platforms that maintained and directed traffic through the corridors. She threw everything humanity had into the offensive, every ship that could fight, and every crew that could fly, and she knew that if it failed, there would be nothing left to try, because this was the kind of gamble that a species only gets to make once. The Veilith were spread thin across their vast territory, because they had enemies everywhere now. The Ghost Fleet was still tearing apart their supply lines, the Droon factories were still bleeding them with sabotage, and the Ilshari navigators were still making their convenient mistakes. And they could not respond to all 12 strikes at the same time. 3 Nexus relay stations were destroyed in the first wave, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Entire sectors of the Empire lost contact with each other. Supply shipments that had been running on precise schedules for centuries suddenly had nowhere to go. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the core worlds of the Veilith Empire experienced shortages. Food reserves dropped, military resupplies slowed to a crawl, and the bureaucratic machinery that kept the Empire functioning began to grind and stutter like an engine running out of fuel. And then the Ilshari made their move. The Ilshari Navigators Guild had been watching the war with the careful patience of a species that had learned over centuries of servitude to never act until the moment was exactly right. And now they decided the moment had arrived. They declared neutrality, which meant that every Ilshari navigator on every Veilith warship simply stopped working. Devastating. Without Ilshari navigators, the Veilith fleet could still travel between stars, but their long-range coordination degraded by 40% overnight, which meant that fleets that should have arrived at battle zones in hours now took days, and reinforcements that were desperately needed arrived too late to matter. Sovereign Tylvron responded the only way the Veilith knew how to respond to disobedience. He ordered reprisals against Ilshari civilians on worlds where they had no military protection, and he expected this to bring them back into line, because punishment had always brought tributary species back into line. It did not bring them back into line. Instead, it backfired so catastrophically that even Tylvron's most loyal advisors could not pretend otherwise. 2 more tributary species saw what was happening to the Ilshari, and decided that if the Empire was going to punish them anyway, then they might as well earn the punishment. Revolted, the cracks were becoming fractures, and the fractures were becoming chasms, and then the Droon rose. On the factory world of Keth Valar, a scarred old Droon elder named Gorthan had been waiting for this moment for longer than most humans had been alive. He had been organizing quietly for decades, building networks and storing weapons, and keeping his people ready for a day that he was never sure would come, but that he refused to stop believing in. When the Nexus corridors fell, and the Veilith fleet scattered, and the Ilshari walked away from their posts, Gorthan gave the signal. In a single coordinated action, the Droon workers of Keth Valar seized control of the planet's largest weapons foundry, the very foundry where they had been forced to build the instruments of their own oppression for 2,000 years, and they turned those instruments around. Gorthan broadcast a declaration to the galaxy, and it was not written in the formal diplomatic language that the Veilith used or the careful measured words that human politicians favored. It was raw and rough, and full of the fury of a people who had been enslaved for longer than most civilizations had existed. "The humans taught us something we had forgotten," Gorthan said, his deep voice shaking with emotion that he did not try to hide. "Chains only hold those who stop pulling." Within weeks, Droon uprisings spread to 11 factory worlds across the Empire, and each one was a dagger in the belly of the Veilith war machine, because those factories had been building the ships and weapons that the Empire needed to fight humanity. And now they were building nothing at all, or worse, they were building weapons for the wrong side. Major Sarah Voss watched the uprising spread from her intelligence post and understood that the war had entered a new phase. It was no longer humanity against the Empire. It was the Empire against everyone it had ever conquered. A fight the Valith could not win, no matter how many ships they had. Voss worked around the clock to build what she called the Alliance of the Defiant. And it was not a formal alliance, because there was no time for treaties and negotiations. It was a coordination network, a web of communication channels that allowed species who had never worked together to share information and support each other in real time. Human tactical advisors were smuggled onto Droon worlds to help organize the resistance fighters. They taught them how to fight Valith ground forces, how to set ambushes and build fortifications and maintain supply lines. And the Droon learned fast, because a species that has spent 2,000 years building weapons knows more about them than anyone. Ilshari navigators who had walked away from the Valith fleet began sharing real-time intelligence about Valith ship positions and fleet movements, giving humanity and the Droon advance warning of every attack. Empire planned, and the Rathani, the same Rathani who had told humanity to kneel on the first day of the war, began accidentally allowing human supply ships to pass through their trade corridors without inspection, and when the Valith demanded an explanation, the Rathani merchants spread their wings in the gesture their species used to express helpless confusion, and said they would look into the matter immediately, and then did absolutely nothing. It was messy and fragile and imperfect, and it was the most beautiful thing the galaxy had seen in 12,000 years. And then Admiral Marin did something that was not strategic at all. She took a strike force back to Meridian, the dead world, the glassed world, the world that the Valith had turned into a mirror to show the galaxy what defiance cost. And she cleared the Valith patrol ships from orbit, and sent Marines down to the surface. They landed on the smooth, dead glass that had once been farmland. Children played, and they planted a flag in the ruins of the colony's central plaza, driving the pole into the fused earth with a force that cracked the glass for meters around it. The flag was broadcast on every frequency, to every corner of the galaxy, and beneath it was an inscription that read simply, "We came back." It was not a military victory, and it did not change the strategic situation by a single percentage point, but it changed something far more important. It told every conquered species, and every enslaved people, and every being who had ever been told to kneel, that the past does not have to be the future, that the dead are not forgotten, and that the people who burned this world would answer for it. Sovereign Tiel Vron sat alone in his command chamber on the Will Absolute, and for the first time in the war, he was truly alone, because his advisors had stopped coming to him with solutions, and had started coming to him with reports of disasters that had no solutions. Revolts on 12 worlds, fleet desertions increasing, supply chains collapsing, tributary species declaring neutrality or open rebellion. And now, the image of a human flag, planted on the grave of a world his empire had murdered, being shared and celebrated by every species that had ever dreamed of freedom. He watched the Meridian broadcast on his private screen and understood at last what he was truly fighting. It was not a species, it was an idea, and the idea was that no one has to kneel. And that idea was more dangerous than any fleet, because you cannot bomb an idea, and you cannot glass an idea, and you cannot issue an edict that makes an idea surrender. The Empire had not just started a war, it had started a revolution. 18 months after the Edict of Submission, the Valith Eternal Empire was dying, and Sovereign Tielvron knew it, and knowing it made him dangerous in a way he had never been before, because a cornered predator does not think about survival. It thinks about making sure its enemy does not survive either. He stood before his war council one final time and announced Operation Divine Mandate, Every remaining loyal fleet in the Empire would be gathered into a single, massive armada, and sent directly to Earth, not to conquer it or occupy it, or force it to kneel, but to destroy it completely and permanently, to turn humanity's homeworld into another meridian, a dead mirror in the dark. His logic was cold and clear and desperate. If Earth died, the symbol died. And if the symbol died, then the rebellions would lose their fire, and the Empire could spend the next century grinding the embers to dust, because empires are patient and revolutions are not. Valith had left. Every warship and every carrier and every bomber that still answered to the Sovereign, pulled from every sector and every patrol route and every defensive position, leaving the rest of the Empire naked and unprotected, because none of that mattered if this one strike succeeded. 3,000 warships assembled at the staging point near the Valith core systems, and it was the largest fleet the Empire had put together in over 1,000 years, a wall of metal and fury that darkened the stars when it moved. Lian Zhao's ghost fleet intercepted the orders 72 hours before the armada launched. Zhao broke communication silence for the first time in months and sent a single encrypted burst to Admiral Marin, and the message contained the full operational details of Divine Mandate. The fleet composition, the approach vector, the timing, everything. Marin read the message and sat in silence for exactly 60 seconds, and then she began giving. Every Terran warship was recalled from every position across human space. Patrol ships, and garrison fleets, and escort vessels, and armed transports, and everything that could carry a gun and travel faster than light was ordered to Sol system immediately, and there were no exceptions and no reserves held back, because there was nothing to hold back for. 800 ships. That was everything humanity had. Every vessel that had survived 18 months of the most brutal war the galaxy had ever seen, crewed by men and women who had not slept properly in weeks, and who had lost friends and family and entire worlds, and who were still fighting because they had decided a long time ago that stopping was not something they knew how to do. Marin looked at the numbers and knew they were not enough. 800 against 3,000 was not a battle, it was a last stand, and last stands only work in stories, and this was not a story, this was real, and the math was real, and the Valith guns were real. So she did something she had never done before. She sent a message to every species in the Alliance of the Defiant, to every Droon rebel, and every Ilshari navigator, and every Rithani merchant who had quietly helped humanity survive. And the message was not a request, and not a demand, but something in between. They are coming for Earth, she said. Every ship they have left is pointed at our home, and if it falls, then everything we have all fought for falls with it. Because they will not stop at Earth. They will come for you next, all of you, and this time there will be no one left to inspire you to fight back. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was raw. If you want to be free, now is the time to decide what that is worth. The Valith Armada dropped out of FTL in Sol system on a Wednesday morning, and the sight of it would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it. The space between Mars and Jupiter. So many that their combined mass distorted local gravity readings. A tide of imperial wrath that had come to drown the world that dared to say no. Admiral Marin positioned her fleet at the lunar perimeter, the last defensive line before Earth, and she looked at the wall of enemy ships on her tactical display, and felt fear, and pushed it down to the place where she kept all the things that were true, but not useful. The battle began. The Valith came in waves, massive capital ships supported by swarms of fighters, pushing forward with the relentless pressure of a species that had decided this was the end, one way or another. And they hit the Terran defensive lines like a hammer hitting glass. The outer defense stations fell in the first hour, and the Mars orbital platforms fell in the second, and humanity's fleet was being pushed back and ground down and torn apart by sheer overwhelming force, and every ship that died was a ship. That could not be replaced, because there were no more ships, and no more shipyards, and no more time. Marin held the lunar perimeter with everything she had, using every trick and every tactic and every desperate improvisation that 18 months of war had taught her. And it was not enough. The Vaylith were breaking through on the flanks, and her center was buckling, and her reserves were already committed, and there was nothing left to commit. And then the long-range sensors lit up. Contacts, hundreds of them dropping out of FTL on the Vaylith Armada's exposed flank. And for one terrible second, Marin thought they were Vaylith reinforcements, and her heart stopped. Then the identification signals came through. Droon war barges, massive, ugly, brutal ships built in seized factories by a species that had been building warships for others for 2,000 years and had finally decided to build some for themselves. And there were over 100 of them, and they hit the Vaylith flank like a fist made of iron and rage. Ilshari scout ships appeared next, small and fast, flooding the battle space with jamming signals that tore apart Vaylith fleet communications, turning their coordinated armada into a confused mass of individual ships that could no longer talk to each other or coordinate their attacks. And then, impossibly, beautifully, absurdly, a flotilla of Rathani merchant vessels dropped out of FTL. Cargo ships that had been hastily fitted with weapons by a species of traders who had never fought a war in their entire history, but who had looked at each other across their elegant bridges and decided that some things were worth more than profit. Gorthan's voice crackled across the human command channel, rough and deep and full of a fire that had been burning for 2,000 years. "You answered the Empire with flame," he said. "Did you think you would burn alone?" Directions simultaneously, and the battle that followed was chaos and fury and desperate courage on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. Droon war barges slugged it out with Vaylith capital ships at close range, trading blow for blow with a ferocity that stunned the Imperial gunners, while Terran wolf packs tore through the gaps in the Vaylith formation, and Ilshari jammers kept the enemy blind and confused. The Vaylith armada shattered, not all at once. Nothing that large breaks all at once, but piece by piece, as ships lost contact with their commanders and captains made individual decisions to fight or flee, and more of them chose to flee because the will that had held them together was breaking apart like ice in a river. Sovereign Tylvron's flagship, the Will Absolute, the same ship that had hung over Earth 18 months ago and demanded that humanity kneel, found itself surrounded, its escort fleet destroyed, its weapons failing, its hull breached. In a dozen places, Marin offered him surrender. He refused because he was Vaylith, and the Vaylith did not kneel any more than humans did. And perhaps in that moment he understood something about his enemy that he had never understood before. It did not matter, because his bridge crew mutinied. They took control of the ship and signaled surrender, unwilling to die for an empire that was already gone. And Tylvron stood in the center of his broken bridge and watched his crew lay down their weapons, and felt the 12,000-year weight of the Vaylith Eternal Empire settle on his shoulders and then slide off like dust. The battle was over. The war was not over on that day. It would take another 2 years for the full collapse of the imperial structure, as tributary species negotiated their independence, and Vaylith core worlds withdrew inward to deal with the unfamiliar experience of existing without an empire to sustain them. The moment when everyone knew how it would end. Humanity did not claim the throne that the Vaylith left empty. Admiral Marin was offered the title of Galactic Commander by the Coalition species, and she declined it so quickly that the diplomats who made the offer barely finished speaking before she said no. "We did not fight a war against an empire so we could become one," she told them, and that was the end of that conversation. Instead, humanity helped build something new, the Compact of Free Worlds, a voluntary alliance based on mutual defense and open trade, with no edicts and no overlords and no species above any other. And the only rule that every member agreed on was written into the founding document in every language of every species that signed it. No one kneels. Years passed, and the galaxy healed in the way that living things heal, slowly and imperfectly, and with scars that would never fully fade. On a quiet day, on a rebuilt Earth, a Veilith historian named Selitharn sat across from an aged Admiral Marin in a garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean and asked her the question that had haunted his species since the day the edict was refused. "Why?" he asked, and his voice carried the genuine confusion of someone who had studied the war for years and still could not make the numbers work. "You could not have known you would win. Your fleet was outnumbered. Your worlds were burning. Every rational calculation said you would lose. Why did you fight?" Marin was quiet for a long time, and the ocean moved beneath them, and the wind carried the smell of salt and green things growing. And when she finally spoke, her voice was tired and scarred and unbroken. "Because you told us to kneel," she said, and we looked at each other, all 17 billion of us, across every colony and every ship and every factory floor, and we remembered who we are. She paused, and the sunlight caught the old battle scars on her. "We are the species that learned to control fire," she said, "and never once considered putting it out." The Veilith historian wrote her words down carefully, and when he published his account of the war, he titled it with a phrase that Gorthan the Droon had spoken during the Battle of Earth, a phrase that had become the motto of the Compact of Free Worlds, and was carved above the entrance to every embassy and every council chamber and every school on every free world in the galaxy. "Did you think you would burn alone?" And across the stars, on 100 worlds that had once been conquered and were now free, the answer was the same. No,